Hey, what's up YouTube? Logan Johnson YGO here, and today I have a tier list for YCS Anaheim. I'm going to be ranking the decks where I feel they are going into this YCS this weekend. We're just a couple days out, and I did a tier list like this for Vancouver, and I think my predictions were actually pretty accurate, and you guys seem to enjoy the videos, so I thought I'd give you guys another one before this event. And as you guys can see, I have the decks laid out here at the bottom, and let's get right into it. Starting off with the previous two YCS winning decks. First off, I'm going to rank the most controversial deck, and that is the Primite Odon deck. So we actually just got the deck list for this if you guys haven't seen it. It's pretty interesting. It runs a lot of traps, a lot of hand traps, not a lot of starters. The deck doesn't look great going second. It has some conflictions with Impulse, which the deck actually plays. I'm not the biggest fan of this deck. From my understanding, the guy who won the YCS won a lot of die rolls. I don't know if this is accurate or not. If you are winning die rolls with this deck, it's obviously going to be very strong. However, I'm going to put this deck in Fringe top 32. I don't know if I could see this deck really winning or getting top 8 again. You'd have to have a really good run or really like innovate the deck. But I think for what it is, I think it is still a playable deck, and I think it could top 32 this YCS. Next up is Triff's deck. This is the Mitsurugi, Nouvelles, Angry Burger, Miracle Raven, Yummy deck. This deck is interesting because I do think this deck is quite good. I think any deck that has Mitsurugi cards and Yummy in it is going to perform pretty well. What you put in beside that I don't think matters as much, whether you're playing breakers, breakers and hand traps, 50 cards, 60 cards. If you know how to play the game, you're good at the game, you know how to play your deck, you have Mitsu cards, you have Yummy cards in your deck, you're going to perform fairly well. So I'm going to put this deck in Fringe top 8. The reason I'm going to put it in Fringe top 8 is not necessarily because I think it's worse than other decks I'm going to put in top 8. I just think most players are not going to really play this deck. So there's going to be a low representation. However, if Triff pulls up with this deck, I would not be surprised to see him in top 8 with this strategy again. Next up, this is a deck that dominated, the last couple of formats. It was a top 2 deck for a while, and that's Malice. I actually think this deck is still pretty solid. It has the ability to run Impulse. It has the ability to run a lot of Bestials, which is really strong right now. A lot of non-engine. Most decks right now are on breakers or a combination of breakers and hand traps, so its combos are going to resolve a lot of the time. And its end board isn't really any different than before. It's still just as powerful. However, the deck does still have issues. It is weaker to some combination of hand traps. It does struggle playing into some half boards, especially some of the Mitsurugi half boards. And it does have some minor consistency issues. So with that, I'm going to put the deck in top 32. I think it's pretty likely that we see at least one of these in top 32. Would I be super surprised if it got top 8? Not super surprised, but I would be surprised. So I think top 32 is a really solid spot for it. Up next, we have the more traditional like Mitsu Yummy deck without the Nouvelles cards. This is going to stay closer to 40, 42 cards, maybe 45 cards. I'm going to put this up in top 8. And like I said, I'm going to put it above Triff's deck just because I think this will have a higher representation. Therefore, it'll have a better conversion rate. The Yummy cards are fantastic. The Mitsu cards are fantastic. They have good synergies. Obviously, whenever you're combining two decks like this, two engines like this, you're going to have some give and take from the other decks. There's going to be less non-engine. You're going to play a few more bricks. You might play a few more cards in your deck. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not a strictly better deck than pure Mitsu or pure Yummy. It's just a good deck that does stuff differently, and it does some things better and some things worse. But I would expect this deck to take up at least 1 or 2 spots in top 8. Next up, we have the deck of the format at Nationals, in my opinion, which was Risle Mitsu. This deck technically didn't lose a ton. I mean, obviously it lost King of Fairlamps, which is big. And it lost an X-Risle, which I don't think is that important. The King of Fairlamps being the bridge is somewhat important. However, the Risle cards are still very good. You can still end on a good board when you open just Risles. And when you open the Mitsu cards, you can still bridge into the Risles. So I think that's fine. However, the issue with this deck is, number 1, non-engine. Not a lot of space for non-engine. Number 2, how it plays into the other decks isn't fantastic in my opinion. I think it can struggle against the pure Mitsu deck at times. And I also just think going second with the deck in general is somewhat difficult at times. I think this deck really benefited from a format where you could get away with playing 6 Chummies and 3 Droll. However, I do not think it's a bad deck. I just don't think the Risle cards alone are quite doing enough to win games, especially against decks like Draco Tail, where like one Ketu could really just break your Risle board. However, I do think this deck is still strong and it's still solid. Do I think it's better than Malice? I don't think so. You don't get to play Impulse in this deck. So I would put this deck on the fringe of top 32. Would not shock me if 1 or 2 got in. But I also just don't think a lot of people will be pulling up with this deck when there's so many other Mitsu strategies that I think are just better. Another Mitsu strategy, you guys are going to see a lot of Mitsurugi strategies here. And that's Mitsu Fiendsmith. This did top, I believe, the YCS and Lil. And this is a really interesting deck because you can still bridge fairly easily with Exciton Knight, making a rank 4. And I know a lot of people were saying originally that, you know, losing Moon in this deck didn't really matter because you have Exciton. However, I kind of tend to disagree there. I think a lot of the game states where Moon comes up is when you have like a Nib on field, Bystials on field, Hand Traps on field. You know, you're in these grinding game states where you just have 2 random bodies on field, and suddenly now those aren't full Fiendsmith combo. I think that's a big hit to the deck. I also just think that not being able to play Impulse is another massive hit to the deck. I do think this deck can top. I think it has some good things going for it. But I think it's right in that same range of Mitsu Risle. There's just other better Mitsu strategies to play. However, if you like this deck, it's your pet deck, you know, I think this deck can do very well. I do think it can be in the fringe top 32. And I would maybe even put it above Mitsu Risle just because of the non-engine space. Let's go kind of towards the back of this list here. Let's bring up Blue Eyes to the front. So this is a deck that, if you guys watched the last podcast with Aaron on the Bubble podcast, I actually thought this deck had a chance to win like Peru. I think this deck oddly has some pretty good matchups right now. Against Yummy, having the guy on board, the Blue Eyes Synchro that prevents monsters from summoning, you know, 2 or more at one time is pretty solid. And this is also one of the few decks in the format that has like spell negates and omni negates with, you know, with Drill Beam. They have the Blue Eyes Synchro that negates a card. You have access to like Crimson Dragon, Cosmic Blazer, stuff like that. The issue with Blue Eyes will always just be consistency and its ability to play second into boards with just engine. However, I do think if you are a skilled Blue Eyes player and you like this deck, there's no problem bringing this to a YCS. I think you can, you know, be on the fringes of making top 32 with this deck. I would put it below these Mitsu strategies, but I do think it is not a terrible choice to bring to an event. It is a very solid, safe mid-range deck. It just lacks the upside and ceiling that other good decks in the format have. Let's look at a deck that does not lack upside or ceiling, and that is Lunalite. This deck's end board is technically unbeatable game 1 for most decks. You're knocking out Liger Dancer game 1. The issue with this deck, however, is it's very easy to side deck against. You have cards like Wosu, you have cards like Lava Golem, Dark Spirit's Mastery off of Thrust. You have cards like Kaijus. You have unique extra deck cards like Underworld Goddess, Zilgin of Gilliphonia or Zilliphonia, whatever it's called, the Reptile Link 3. There's a lot of unique ways to out Liger, and people are preparing for that. The other thing too right now is every single side deck is on Droll. Most side decks are on D-Barrier. There's a lot of, you know, like anti-spell, stuff like that. There's Inscription, Mistaken Arrest. There's a lot of hate for this deck that isn't necessarily for this deck. It's just for Mitsu, but also overlaps with this. You know, DD Crow, Bestial, stuff like that as well. So I think the time for this deck is kind of past. I think there will be a time in the format where, you know, maybe some of those cards rotate out of the format, aren't quite as popular. People aren't ready. You know, maybe they don't have the Kaijus, the Lava Golems and stuff in their deck. But I think for Anaheim, people will have those cards ready. And therefore, I wouldn't think that this deck could be fringe top 8. I would move it more towards top 32 to fringe top 32. I'm pretty certain that at least one will make it, so I'm going to put it in top 32. I think it's more likely that one makes it than one doesn't. Next up, this is Wosu. I have this as pure Mitsurugi because this is like, you know, the pure Mitsu deck can really utilize Wosu more than the other Mitsu strategies. I think this is obvious top 8. Pure Mitsu is going to top 8 this event. It's a really great deck. When the deck gets to play, it's very solid. It's not really weak to anything. Even Droll isn't that bad. You know, anytime you get to start Ritual Spell plus Murakumo, you're just playing through draw really well. Anytime you have Prayers plus Ritual, you're playing through draw really well. You have cards like Callby, you have cards like Talents. Post side, you have cards like D-Fissure, Floodgates, Thrust, stuff like that. Going second, this deck's engine is very strong. It can play through a Yummy board. It can play just eat through half boards very, very easily. It's just a very clean, solid, good Yu-Gi-Oh deck right now. The issues with it are, number one, there's a lot of hate towards the deck in terms of, you know, Mistaken Arrest, D-Barrier, Bestials, DD Crow, Bell, Purge. All these cards hurt this deck quite a bit. Even an Ash Blossom can hurt this deck quite a bit. But the number one issue with this deck is just consistency. There's a very high number of hands that just pass to one Ash or one Purge. There's a lot of hands where you draw, you know, multiple Aramasa, multiple Habakiri, and sure, maybe you're able to get off, you know, most of your combo or make a half board, but you don't have non-engine backing it up, and you know, end up being kind of weak into like breakers or, you know, engine plus breakers, stuff like that. However, there's going to be so many people that bring this deck. There's some cool tech stuff you can do with this deck. You know, you can play Fossil Dine in the side, D-Fissure, like I said before, breakers, hand traps combination. I think this deck has enough utility, enough flexibility that it will adapt to the format and maintain a top threat, and I would expect several in top 8, probably 2 or 3. Another Mitsu deck, this is Mitsu Orchest. We tried this deck at the beginning of the format. I'm not really a fan. I can't say I'm an Orchest expert, but it just feels like a worse version of any other Mitsu deck that you're playing. I'm gonna lump it in just down here with the other Mitsu decks, the other Mitsu like Fiendsmith, Mitsu, Risle. Maybe it's a little bit better because it sets up an Omni Negate. The Fiendsmith deck kind of sets up an Omni Negate with Desiree. However, this almost always gets to an Omni Negate, and I think Omnis are just really, really good right now and something you want to be doing with every deck if possible. Just because they're few and far between. Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have a lot of like generic Omnis anymore, so if you can set that up, I think your deck is doing something well, and I think that's kind of the reason that this Odon Primite deck did well, is because it could set up multiple Omnis. Speaking of Omnis, another deck that can set up Omnis is Crescent Canine. So this was a fringy deck last format, and a lot of people kind of thought it was dead with the banning of Dice Smashers and the limitation of inclusion. However, Naroya is a big boost to this deck. And I also just think like the power level of the format dropping down a notch is also a boost to this deck. I've seen a lot of success with some of my friends playing this deck, and I think it's really, really solid. Plays a good amount of non-engine, not a ton, but a solid amount, like 16, 17. I think going first, it sets up one of the best end boards in the game, and I think it does it pretty consistently. The issue with this deck, however, is I think playing second into some yummy boards is pretty difficult. Getting your Canine cards booked, getting your Canine cards interacted with is just too easy for the yummy deck to do. Some other issues I see with this deck is, now that the format's moving more towards breakers, I think some of the Crescent boards are kind of susceptible to that, especially cards like Dark Ruler, potentially Super Poly, Droplets. So I would not be surprised if the Crescent deck starts looking more towards going into the Artifact Mjolnir lock. I'm not really sure how to say that card, but yeah, the Artifact lock. I think there's a lot of ways that this deck can adapt. I think having the searchable Floodgate against Yummy is really strong. Searchable Regulus post set is really strong. And I think this is a deck that could, in theory, side Lava Golem. So in the same sense of like these other decks where I said, you know, having an Omni Negate is really strong, this can put up an Omni Negate with Infinity. I think the number of non-engine it plays is a little bit higher than some of the decks down here, like, you know, maybe like Mitsu Fiendsmith, which I think is really solid. And, you know, Zuna is technically non-engine. And I think its end board and its overall ceiling is better, and the cards work better together. You know, like drawing Fiendsmith by itself isn't as good as drawing, you know, Crescent by itself or Canine by itself. So because of that, I'm going to put this in top 32. I'm going to put it above Malice, just because I think Crescent is going to get to its end board more often than Malice in most cases. I just think it's a little bit harder to interact with hand traps than Malice is right now. I think losing Splash Mage has made Malice somewhat easy to interact with the hand traps, and I think interacting with hand traps against a Crescent Canine deck is pretty difficult. So I would not be surprised if Crescent Canine made top 8. But it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough. It's either top of top 32 or it's bottom of fringe top 8. I think I'm going to put it here. just because I do think that there's a very good chance that one sneaks in. However, I don't know, like, the numbers are just not really adding up. You know, like if I think 2 of this will get in, 2 of this will get in, 2 of this will get in, you know, there's only so many more decks that can get in. But I do think Christian Canine could take one spot pretty feasibly. Up next, we have the Canine Canine Vanquish Soul. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank there. Sorry. Canine Vanquish Soul. This was the deck of last format. You know, this and Yummy. This deck took a beating in the ban list. You know, Rosin to 1, Smasher's gone, Stake Your Soul gone, or Stake Your Soul to 1. Not my favorite choice right now. The deck is really inconsistent. I think it does one thing well, and that's it beats Draco Tail. Aside from that, I don't like this deck at all. The ratios of the deck are bad. Not enough non-engine, not enough starters. Doesn't line up super well into Yummy at all. I think it's just a good counter to Draco Tail, and that's about it. I would put it at bottom of Fringe top 32. I don't think it's much better than Blue Eyes right now. Moving on, we have Momento. This is a deck that a lot of people thought would do well under the new ban list, but actually just has not done anything from what I've seen. I don't think it topped either of the YCSs, and I think that is because breakers are just so powerful into this deck. All of them, Lightning Storm, Duster, evenly, you know, Dark Ruler solid into this deck, Droplet can be solid into this deck, all Super Poly can be solid into this deck. All those are really broken into this deck. But the big thing is just Draco Tail obliterates this. Like one Ketu, one Rahu can pretty much break the whole Memento board unless you're doing like an artifact lock or something. Other issues with the Memento deck is it just doesn't play a lot of non-engine. It does play a lot of good starters, but not a lot of non-engine. And I think right now, if you're playing a deck that doesn't have a lot of non-engine, you want your board to be basically unbeatable, or you want to be doing some sort of lock. So I think if people innovate the Memento deck to do the artifact lock, I think it could be a better choice. Maybe Canine Memento, something like that. But just from what we've seen, the data we've seen, and I don't think very many you know, really good players are going to pull up with the Memento deck, I would put this on Fringe top 32. I think I would still choose it over... I would probably choose it over these decks, but I think I would play Lunalite and Malice before I played Memento, so I would put it here. Up next, Fire King. We saw some experimentation with this deck in Lille, with Dinka playing it. They're playing the Drak cards in it, which are interesting. They offer, you know, board breaking options on turn 0. However, they are pretty weak to cards like DD Crow and Ash, Call by the Grave, all that stuff. Not my favorite deck. It's not super consistent. Its end board I don't think is strong enough. It plays an okay amount of non-engine, but not, you know, enough, you know, not as much as like a deck like Pure Yummy could. So I don't think it has enough going for it. While its engine is strong, the Mitsu engine is also just, I think it's just stronger. So I don't think many people will play it. I think the people who will play it are going to have a tough time. I don't think the deck is that fantastic right now, and I think there's a lot of hate for, you know, graveyard decks right now. There's a lot of Bells, there's a lot of DD Crows, there's a lot of Inscriptions running around, Shifter, Defissure, stuff like that. I would put it either the bottom of Fringe top 32 or not topping. I think it's more likely not to top, so unfortunately I will put Fire King down here, even though I know it is kind of a fan favorite. Up next, Gemini. I'm kind of a hater of this deck. I don't really like decks that choose second and just let you play and do what you want, because I think good players can exploit that, and if they know they're playing against like a Gemini deck or like, you know, a breaker deck, they're going to build their end board as layered as possible, and they're going to side deck, you know, accordingly to beat your deck. And also just like as the tournament gets later and later, you're going to find out who's playing these go second decks. You're going to find out who's playing Gemini, and there's going to be players who send you first. So because of that, I'm not a huge fan of this deck in a YCS format. I think this is more of like a DB ladder deck. I think it can perform better there than in person. However, I do think the deck is good enough to still perform at a YCS. Would I take it over Lunalite? Would I take it over Malice? I don't think so. Would I take it over Memento? Probably. So I think top of Fringe top 32 is like a really good spot for this. I think there's going to be some really skilled Gemini players who pull up with this deck. There's probably going to be 3 or 4 really good Gemini players in the room, and I think there's a good chance 1 or 2 of them make top 32. So I think top of Fringe top 32 is a good spot. Up next, Mermail. This is a very scary deck. The Waterlock is annoying with the barrier statue. However, this deck just has not really performed, as you would think. I think a lot of people have tested it. It just has not worked as well as people had hoped. The deck is pretty much untouched. It's a very high ceiling deck going first. Going second, its engine plays pretty well in the boards, but I don't think the deck lines up well enough into the meta right now because of Herald of the Arclight. Just too many decks are ending on Herald of the Arclight right now, and the decks that aren't ending on Herald of the Arclight are ending on several Omni Negates, which is also difficult for Mermail to deal with. I think this deck had a better time playing into, Risle half boards and such, where your opponent was, ending on Detonator Pass. So I don't think right now this is the best choice. I think it still can top 8 or top 32, but it is definitely in that fringe territory where probably around where the Gemini deck is. I think I would take Gemini before I take Mermail. And obviously this isn't necessarily a tier list of what I would play, but my opinion is going to be based on somewhat of what I would play and what I would take to an event. So I do think this deck is an okay choice if you wanted to play it. I do think it can top 32. I don't see it going that deep into top 32. I don't see it, going X1 in Swiss, maybe not even, probably not X2 in Swiss, but I do think this deck could get you to X3, get you into that top 32, top 64. And of course, any deck in fringe top 32, it does have a chance to top 8, but it's just unlikely, and I think this is a good place for the Mermail deck. Up next, Canine Sulfacord. We saw this deck perform okay at Lille. We actually saw some stream feature matches. The deck looked pretty solid. It's doing the artifact lock, and I think any deck that can consistently pull off the artifact lock is going to be a solid choice. And I do think this deck is good, but I just don't think it'll have the representation. I think there's going to be people who aren't willing to learn the Sulfacord cards, and there's just going to be a lot of people who are just on the decks of last format, which were, Mitsu, Yami, Draco. So because of that, I'm going to put it in top 32. I think this deck is good. I think it plays, some unique non-engine. It can play Orange Light. It can play Azuna. Those are, unique non-engine, solid non-engine. And just any deck that can artifact lock is going to have a really good opportunity. At an event where you're playing against so many good players, and sometimes just, stealing victories with, locking your opponent out of the game is just like a really, really strong strategy. So I'm going to keep this in top 32. I think it's kind of in this gimmicky type deck with Lunalite. I think these are both somewhat gimmicky, but also stronger than some of the decks down here. Next up, White Forest. I don't believe in this deck. I'm putting this in not topping. I've had hope for this deck several times. I don't feel like anybody's going to make it work. It doesn't play enough non-engine. It really doesn't play enough starters. The deck's not good enough in the boards. It doesn't do anything super unique. It just has a bunch of okay cards, and it has like an okay M board. And its M board is, honestly not even that strong. It's somewhat weak to breakers. You can hand trap the deck. Pretty much any non-engine is good against this deck if you compare it. If somebody is a White Forest one trick out there and they bring it to the YCS with, hundreds of hours of playtesting and a refined deck, could it get top 32? Yes. Is it likely? Absolutely not. I'm going to keep it down here with Fire King. Up next, Sky Striker. I like this deck a lot. I know there's a lot of people that are very high on this deck with the new Magnificestorm card that draws 2. However, this deck does have some issues. Number one, it doesn't really play hand traps, so you're going to just be playing a lot of games where your opponent's just going to full board you, and you're going to be playing into Omni Negates, you're going to be playing into Pseudo Locks, you're going to be playing into cards like Fossil Dyna, Herald of the Arclight, all of these broken go first cards, and just letting your opponent get to that point every time and relying on breaking the board is just not going to be feasible over, a 15 round tournament. However, the striker cards are all good. When you draw a hand with the striker deck, you don't really ever brick. You always draw like good solid hands. So that's why I think this deck could get into top 32 under the new rules, where, you could afford to lose 3 times. You could maybe even afford to lose 4 times if it's top 64. And I think the Sky Striker deck just has enough good cards, and it doesn't play very many bricks, that it could get to that 10, 11, 12 win mark, but probably not much past that. So because of that, I think fringe top 32 is a good spot. I think I would still take Gemini before I take the Sky Striker deck, but I think this is a very safe spot for this deck. And speaking of Magnificestorm cards, the Radiant Typhoon deck, whatever you want to call it, unfortunately, this deck's not topping. I actually think it's worse than White Forest. I I've seen this deck play. It just doesn't do enough. It plays some like really awkward cards. Its M board just isn't strong enough. Going second, it's not strong enough. It's just like, it's just missing. It's just missing pieces. It's not there yet. I would not recommend taking this deck to an event. I don't think it's going to top. Maybe you can mix the Radiant Typhoon cards with something else like Runic or, you know, Speedroids or, you know, Tri-Brigade, something like that, and maybe you could have some good results. But unfortunately, if you're a fan of this deck, I don't think it's going to top. I would be very shocked if it does. And the last two decks we have here are actually some big names in the format. We have Pure Yummy. I think this is an obvious top 8. I would not be surprised if there's 2 or 3 of this in top 8. Is it better than Mitsu Yummy? I don't know. I think these two decks are very, very close in power level. It really just depends on, you know, what you like to play as a player. You want to play the more combo, you know, heavier engine type deck, or do you want to play more non-engine? Can you find a way to innovate both these decks? Can you find a way to innovate Pure Yummy to make it better into breakers, safer into breakers, stuff like that? Can you make a way to, can you innovate the Mitsu Yummy deck to reduce the number of bricks? Can you fit more non-engine? Can you make the combos cleaner, etc.? So I think both these decks are, you know, 1A, 1B, however you want to look at it. They're both going to top 8. Both great picks for the event. Yeah, not a lot to say there. And next up, Draco Tail. I am a big Draco Tail hater. However, I do think that this deck will convert at least one spot to top 8 just because of how many people are actually bringing the deck to the event. And I actually think there's going to be quite a few really good players who will bring the deck to the event. However, I really am not a big fan of this deck. I think the non-engine people are playing right now is just way too powerful. Ash, Purge, Bell, all insane against this deck. Forbidden Droplet, insane against this deck. Going first, the deck is fairly consistent, but its M board is so weak that it can just lose to a hand of good engine and like one Ash Blossom. And going second, Yummy is supposed to be your best matchup, but if they get to establish the Herald, you kind of just lose the game. So I think this deck just has too many issues right now, and not having enough one-card starters where your deck has to constantly have 2 cards to play every single game is also just not a great spot to be deck building, deck construction wise. So because of that, I'm going to put it at the back end of Fringe top 8. I really want to put this in top 32 because I think there's a very good chance that it doesn't top 8, but just because of the number of players going to the event that are going to be playing this deck and the number of good players that I know that will pull up with this deck, I think that they will carry at least one into the top 8. But with that being said, if you guys enjoyed this tier list, you know, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think will win YCS Anaheim, and I'll see you guys next time.